Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon if it's afternoon, and good night if it's night. My name is Amanda Lamont, and I am very pleased to welcome you to our joint webinar this evening on psychosocial safety in the workplace and in emergencies. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which you are all joining us from today, whether that's in Australia, New Zealand, in the Pacific, or elsewhere in the world. I would particularly like to acknowledge this week being NAIDOC week, and this is a week for us all to learn and celebrate and support and understand the beautiful, rich culture and history and heritage and the beautiful lands that we all get to enjoy because of that continued connection and care for land from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here in Australia. So I hope you are all celebrating the week and doing some fantastic, exciting things. There's plenty of events on, and I'm really excited. Whilst we don't have a NAIDOC theme for this event, I'm really excited that we can get to spend some time together tonight, talking about some really interesting topics, and at the same time, recognising how fortunate we are to be joining this network from where we are. I am Amanda Lamont, as I mentioned, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. And I can see Bridget Tian on the screen. Hey, Bridget, one of our other co-founders. It's great to see you. And I can see some familiar faces here tonight. So I mentioned this is a joint webinar this evening, and this is, we haven't done one for a while, but back in 2019, Chris Miller, who's one of our co-facilitators this evening, we had a conversation about opportunities for the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network and the Australian Institute of Emergency Services to join together in an informal partnership so that we could actually expand our networks and give our members an opportunity to learn things from another network and expand the network connections and meet people from slightly different areas. So we've been really delighted to partner with the Australian Institute of Emergency Services and have that ongoing relationship. And I think it's been mutually beneficial for all of us to learn from each other. And I do hope that relationship continues. Chris can tell you a little bit more about the Australian Institute of Emergency Services in a little bit. First of all, I'm going to take the floor and take the opportunity to brag just a little bit about the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network. We very recently passed our 2,000 member threshold. So excited. We started up in 2018. I don't think we really had any idea just how big and influential and hard work would be involved in pulling together this network, but not a moment of regret with all of the people that I've met, conversations that I've had, things that I've learned, and things that I have celebrated. So in our 6-year history, now over 2,000 members in Australia, New Zealand, and our recently established Pacific chapter, and we know that we also have members around the world. The purpose of the network is really to come together, to be together, and to support each other, to promote, recognise, celebrate and support women and the really important role they play in emergencies and disaster resilience. And really importantly for us is to recognise that there are a lot of roles that are played by women in the sector that are not recognised. They're in the shadows, they're in the dark, they're in the corners, and women may not step up and step into the spotlight to say, hey, we're doing this too. So what we want to do as a network is shine the light on all of the women and all of the fabulous jobs that they do in emergencies and disasters, whether it's on the front line, whether it's writing strategy and policy, whether it's working amongst communities to support community recovery and resilience after disasters. So we're so excited to have over 2,000 members, and we recognise diversity and inclusion with all of our members and celebrate all of our allies that support all of our members as well. So thank you to all of you for coming along, and for our expanded group of friends tonight, coming from maybe the Psychosocial Safety Network and also from AIES. So welcome to all of you. In case I forget at the end, I just want to do a few reminders for the Women in Emergencies Network members. We have a member survey out at the moment. Please go to our website, and I'll put the details in the chat. please complete our survey so that we can continue to service you in the best way possible for you. We also have some exciting news coming up about our annual recognition awards, and you'll see more information about that soon, but I just wanted to let you all know about the opportunity to nominate someone fabulous for our Women in Emergencies Network Recognition Awards. So without further ado, Chris, I will pass over to you to tell us all about the great things that AIES is doing and introduce us to our guest speaker tonight. And I'll just mention, I meant to mention this at the start. Unfortunately, our published speaker for tonight, Leanne, has come down with something nasty. She was going to fight on and present, but the problem is her throat is really sore and she's really struggling to talk. But fabulous as she is, she has brought us Brad Skinner, who is going to step in presenter tonight at the last minute. And I'll let Chris introduce him as we lead into the session. So thank you, and over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome all. For those of you less familiar with the Australasian Institute of Emergency Services, we're in our 48th year. So all might be new, but we've been around a while. And some of you will be aware that it took 47 years for the national president to happen to be a woman. Can't rush into these things, but we're very pleased to be able to actually model diversity of the senior team of the board now, whereas perhaps in previous years we didn't look quite so diverse. Now, our background is very interesting in that our membership has been drawn from all sorts of aspects of emergency services, and that's one of the things I find most appealing about the AIES, is we come from all kinds of disciplines and backgrounds, all kinds of experience in emergency services. And so whereas sometimes you get a bit siloed through the AIES, you'll meet all sorts of people doing the most amazing things. And just to quickly explain my committee in Canberra, we had aviation rescue, maritime rescue, recovery services, and me, who's done all sorts of weird, wonderful things, ranging from hanging off ropes and helicopters as a mountain rescuer, and then moving into the police doing counter-terrorism, and then most recently working with the World Bank in health emergency preparedness in a number of countries. So we all come from very unusual backgrounds, and that's a wonderful feature. I did think when I got more involved in the leadership team, we were a bit short on recovery, but the recovery members are growing, and interfacing and the partnership with all has improved our exposure to recovery as well as response. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Brad Skinner, who's the CEO of Coach Communication. He's kindly stepped into the breach. He's a colleague of Leanne's, and at very short notice has kindly agreed to present this evening. We didn't want to disappoint, and we have talked to Leanne about rescheduling her either later in the year or early next year as more of her PhD work develops. So it's over to you, Brad. Thank you so much for stepping up.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Amanda. It is an absolute privilege and an honor to spend some time with you and your members this afternoon. I will share my screen as a first step. Hopefully everybody can see that. I guess in the absence of Lee, and to make sure that we use our time most effectively this afternoon and to play to my strengths and certainly your sector and your needs, I've kind of framed our session today to do about 20 minutes or so of a bit of stimulus, really practical, very much orientated towards tips that you can use in the interactions that you have, I guess, in your world and in the situations that might arise. I obviously don't have the same pedigree as Lee in terms of her appreciation of neuroscience and the brain, but I am very much a practitioner around understanding how we interact and how our brain informs our interactions on a day-to-day basis, and the opportunity that we have to guide our own and others' communication choices in those interactions, both at the workplace, on the front line, and even at home in the conversations that we have with our loved ones. So if there's any questions, certainly, throw your hand up or let me know, or bank them to the end, and we can certainly use them as an opportunity to continue to illustrate and extend on the conversation that we're having today. Okay, a little about me. Just to let you know, yes, I'm the coach CEO. I also am the senior executive sponsor for the Bully Zero Foundation. The foundation is the national leading education and advocacy around anti-bullying for schools, community groups, and workplaces in Australia. And finally, Coach is also a delivery partner for the National Psychosocial Safety Network, and we provide early intervention and prevention supports to a number of key sectors across Australia and New Zealand in terms of reducing and mitigating the risk to psychosocial safety and improving psychological welfare for those at work. Before that, and I guess just to give you a little bit of context for me outside of my current position, I served about 2 decades or a little over 2 decades in the state public service, mostly in things like police, corrective services, environment, and a majority of it in housing and homelessness supports, everything from the front line right through to senior executive roles supporting ministers and director generals. So not to suggest I understand everything that you do, but I have certainly had some exposure into the challenge of providing community supports, disaster recovery, and we also have a deep partnership with the Australian Hospital and Healthcare Association. So a lot of our clients come from emergency room departments, hospital aged care, etc. So it gives me a little bit of exposure into your world, but certainly a respect for the role that you perform and the challenge that confronts some of you in the work that you do. I will state very quickly, we might dance into some territory that might be a little confronting. We do talk about acts of bullying, harassment, discrimination at a theoretical level. And when we use them as examples, I'll obviously navigate and through that conversation with care for you as participants. But if you do feel like it is a particular trigger for you, or you do want me to be able to move through that, then certainly raise your hand or feel comfortable to exit the session. Just to start us off, I guess this is how I define safety. And I know there's a lot of conversation, particularly recently, around the idea of psychological safety, psychosocial safety. Those terms are often misused and interchanged, etc. But I guess for me, at a really practitioner level, and to make sure that we draw our eye to the thing that's most important, safety for me is how we feel in our hearts and stomachs about Monday morning and the week ahead on the Sunday eve before we start the day. And I think for me, this instantly resonates. And I think we've all been in environments where our workplace creates those moments of dread and that feeling of anxiety and unsettledness on a Sunday night as we worry about what's ahead of us for the following day. Lee shared with me a little bit of her work in preparation for today and gave me some statistics. And I guess just to give you a bit of a context in terms of the scale of impact and where there is a particular point of need, about 60%, now obviously that's 2 in every 3 if we're applying some rough maths, of emergency services workers are affected by bad manner at work. We also know that team communication failures account for more than 70% of unanticipated adverse impacts in terms of that frontline emergency room triage moment. I said earlier to Chris as we prepared for the session today, if you think about work in terms of a production line or, Coca-Cola, or my grandfather worked for Golden Circle, the idea of a failed communication is that we might have a delayed process, or the machine banks up, or things fall off the edge. And, obviously there's a risk to that and an impact in terms of commercial cost. But when we're talking about what you guys do and the work that you do, that communication failure can really have a very significant ripple impact on one or hundreds of people as a consequence of where that communication may have faltered or it missed being able to be understood and acted on by the other. So there really is some grave consequence, and it just makes sure that it just means we have to make sure that we get it right first time and every time in the conversations that we have. Finally, and I think this was really helpful for me in terms of setting the scene. Now, I appreciate that for a lot of you, the idea of public behaviors, so things like patients or loved ones, And sometimes the aggression and the anger and the hostility can be really threatening. And I understand the impact of those. But we also know that most workers are more affected by the behavior or rejection from colleagues. And it's because of the repeated exposure to bad manner from those that are that you're supposed to belong to, that do the most harm. If we think about it, that public behavior or that moment of anger or hostility is usually fleeting. And while it can constantly be representing through different members of the public, it really is where we feel mistreated or devalued or disrespected from a colleague who should be a supporter, that will tend to do the most harm in terms of our well-being and our feelings of connectedness to each other, and the thing that drives us to be at work on a day-to-day basis. Alrighty, as we talk about today, like I said to you, I wanted to be really practical. And rather than talk about the theory and talk about the neuroscience, areas that Leanne is much better equipped to be able to speak to, I wanted to give you an idea of, I guess, the tools that are available to us as an employee in any organization, but very much targeted to you guys in terms of your context. On your screen, you'll see the 4 things that I guess I see in everybody's toolkit, which is you'll have codes of conduct, values, behavior expectations, governance, rules, etc., that guide how you interact and how others interact. You'll have your colleagues in terms of those that you work with, work to, that work to you. But the ones that I wanted to focus on is, I guess, your communication and the skills that you use in bringing that issue and I guess your work to life, and the brain of you and those around you in terms of understanding and what we can do to be able to harness the power of both your spoken word and how your brain interacts in those moments of trust and threat response. Alrighty, I guess at a really simple level, and conscious that, the brain is a complex organ, I wanted to talk about the idea of we work in one of 2 ways. And essentially our brain moves through a continuum throughout the day between trust and threat response. Now, it's impossible for us as human beings to be in a perpetual state of trust response, but equally, it takes a gargantuan effort for us to be able to bring ourselves or others back from a threat response. So what we want to do is work very hard to make sure that we keep ourselves as much as possible in those places of trust response, or that when we start to see our behavior or the behavior of others send us into a threat response, we very quickly intervene to be able to bring us back as quickly as possible and reduce the impact and the severity of those moments. The reality is even perpetrators of bad behavior are sent into a threat response, and certainly as the victim of that bad manner, you are equally in a threat response as well. So there's a moment where we need to exercise care and concern, not just for our welfare, but also for the other person involved or other people involved in the situation. And move through those moments of threat response and back to a place of trust response. Now, I'd love us to think, okay, we do that because it's the right thing to do. And for many of you, that will be your driving agenda. But the other thing that's at play here is our cognitive ability, our ability to be able to process information, our creativity, our intellect, our agility, our commitment to cause and those around us only works and sharpens in moments of trust. So if we really are connected to the work that we do and we need everybody on the same page working hard and doing their best, we have to keep ourselves and those around us in a state of trust. At a really basic level, the amygdala it triggers your emotion, and it's not a conscious thing for you. The reality is it's constantly scanning for a threat to you, and it triggers things like the fight or flight or freeze response. It also shrinks glucose and oxygen and reduces, like I said, our cognitive thinking abilities, which is really the most damage that we can do in terms of robbing people of their professional intellect and their professional contribution to the cause that we share in our workplace. That all happens in about 1/80th of a second. So we can go from a positive interaction to one that is disruptive and challenging within 1/80th of a second. To give you an idea of how quick that is or how unconscious that might be, it's the record scratch moment. So it's literally that split second where you will slip from going from a trust response into a threat response, driven solely by the actions or interactions with another person. When we talk about negative communication behaviors, or when we talk about the term bad manner, I want to be clear that both my work, but also what we talk about today, covers every possible moment of bad manner. It can be as subtle as eye rolling, sarcasm, social exclusion, persistent negativity. We can go right through, and our work goes right through to moments of aggression, violence, hostility, discrimination. I've worked in workplaces and have supported them to recover and reset when we have perpetual bad manner, things like eye rolling, social exclusion, sarcasm, etc., right through to suicides, deaths, violent attacks, aggressive behavior, and real moments of incredible hostility, aggression, and violence in the workplace. I've seen it all, and I'm most across most sectors. And when I talk about negative communication or bad manner, I'm talking about the full spectrum of behaviors, and that covers, there's a small amount of them on the screen with you at the moment, but when we talk about bad manner, it's about anything that makes the other person or us feel unsafe at work. I guess driving my agenda today, and I'm about to slide into a really practical sort of 10 tips session. I want you to think about, I guess, when we feel disrespected or unsafe, most of us think we have one of two options. That is that we put up with it, and that means that we try and get through it as quickly as possible, and we tend to go silent, or we remove ourselves from the situation as much as possible, and we kind of just sit and endure it. Although the converse is we look to confront the person, we match with equal hostility, we raise our voice, and it becomes this escalation of bad behavior from one side to the other. The reality is our threat response heightens, the other person's threat response heightens, and we end up having a monologue with each other. So we've stopped having a conversation, our interaction has failed to be effective, and we find ourselves in a circle of confrontation and conflict. But I want to talk to you today about the reality of a different choice, which is the ability to reset that interaction and return it to a place of safety, civility, and ultimately effectiveness in terms of getting the outcome that drove the original conversation or interaction in the first place. The driving, I guess, principle for me, and the thing that makes me feel, I guess, quite liberated in any conversation I have, online, in person, the most challenging or the most simplistic and organic, is the idea that my manner and the manner of those around me matters. And it makes the interaction matter. It's how we're heard, understood, and ultimately acted on. And the thing that's the real kicker for me, or the thing that's the real take home, is in this term of, in this world of psychosocial safety, there's so much that feels overwhelming, and there's so much that feels like we need to be working on to be able to make our workplaces safe. Manner is a key contributor to making yourself and others feel safe. And it's also a lever that's available and within your control in every interaction. And while it may not feel like it, for you and those around you, your manner is always a choice in every interaction that you have. Okay, so let's talk about some tips to be able to guide psychologically safe and effective interactions, in particular for your sector. And during the Q&A, I might share a few of my examples. I've been on the front line of some harrowing situations and supporting colleagues to do the same, and it will give us good ground to be able to illustrate how these techniques I have honed both in practice and also in theory. Okay, the idea that we want to be interaction fit and we prepare our manner as much as our subject matter very quickly when we have more difficult conversations or where we go into hostile situations, we tend to focus on our argument or our case or our point of righteousness or the point of view or the decision that we need to implement. And we don't often think about how do I actually engage in a way? How do I keep myself and those around me safe? And how do I make sure that I'm going to be most understood for what might be a really challenging conversation? And so I want you to start to think about in those opportunities where you do have a moment to reflect or plan, and I'm conscious that not all of your interactions are ones where you'll be gifted with that chance, but where you are given an opportunity to pause and think about how you approach this interaction, to think less about your subject and more around your manner and how you'll approach the conversation to be able to optimize being heard and keeping yourself and those around you safe. Remember, this is not our only chance. For many of us, when we start a conversation or when we're at the mercy of another conversation, we feel obliged to sit in it and endure it. And the reality is, if we're in a threat response or the behavior of those around us is less than ideal, it stops being effective. So it really is a fundamental waste of your time and theirs, because cognitively, you're unable to process and act on the information, even the most resilient or seasoned professional. So the idea is we can take a break when interactions start to deteriorate. And it doesn't have to be confronting or aggressive to be able to call that out. It can simply be, look, I appreciate the depth of this conversation, or I really want to make sure that I can be present for this conversation. Let's circle back after a cup of tea, after a day, after a couple of hours. Not every conversation will give you that window of opportunity, but I also don't want you to feel like every conversation you're at the mercy of somebody else's timing, or that you're victim to bad manner because you can't put a circuit breaker in for that conversation and start afresh with a renewed energy and hopefully a more safe and civil tone. The idea that we describe our points of view rather than argue them. And I think here it's about understanding story. Story is, I guess, our version of what we need and what we know and what we were asking of others, and also what might be the story that's driving the behavior or the issues or the cause or the presenting noise of another person. Sometimes understanding your story, their story, and where that conflict is can really be the power to unlock what might be a declining relationship, or where you just don't feel like you're getting traction in terms of issue resolution. The idea that there's a little bit of care shown for each other. I guess the idea is we do unto others as we would want done to us. Really fundamental, deceptively really simple principle, but often really challenging to honor in those moments where we feel devalued or disrespected or confronted. But ultimately, we deserve respect and courtesy being shown to us, and we also need to and should have a duty of care to be able to show that same respect and courtesy to those around us. Not only does it make sure that you get, I guess, the right thing to do, but ultimately it also makes sure that you're heard and get what you need. And for many of you, that's a driving issue. I mean, deadline delivery is obviously what we talk about for most sectors, but you guys, it's about getting the outcome, the support, the decision, the action that's necessary for you to be able to respond to that situation. And so really care and concern is paramount. The idea that no issue requires us to abandon professional courtesy. Now, if we're talking about feedback, if we're talking about, challenging in views or ideas, we don't want to attack the person, and really we speak to the issue. But the idea that the situation or the issue or our passion or the urgency of a situation means that we can abandon a safe, civil tone and send the entire room into a threat response, it's archaic and unnecessary. I mean, I appreciate the incredible importance and urgency of a lot of the work that you do, but it's incredibly counterintuitive if you are sending, consciously or not, the rest of your team into a threat response, because it is literally robbing them of their contribution and effectiveness to the same cause that you're attempting to resolve and respond to yourself. I want you to think about the idea that we understand the cause of the bad behavior. We can have a moment of empathy or appreciation for the circumstance or how we might have got here, but we never excuse the bad behavior. It's a subtlety there that says, look, I can empathize, even sympathize. I can appreciate what might be driving this behavior, but I won't tolerate it. And particularly recognize your power. You are there in an opportunity to provide support and care and response. You ultimately have the most power here, because if these people refuse to honor basic standards of safety and courtesy, then it's really going to challenge you in terms of being able to provide that level of care and support. We demonstrate courage and respect. We stand in the moment when challenged and safely and respectfully call it out. Look, ultimately, the behavior we walk past is the behavior that we allow. It's a very old adage, but it really does connect us to the idea that we are each responsible for the culture that we create and that we work within, and that sometimes we do need to have that moment of courage to endure that difficult conversation or that challenging interaction, because on the other side of that, our relationship is much richer and much valued as a consequence. we really listen. Now, this is a principle that I constantly am challenged by, because sometimes my passion and my emotion for the issue means that I talk like a bit of an over-caffeinated chipmunk. And also, years of supporting a minister at the very highest of level meant I almost had to be a mind reader as part of my role profile or role description. But someone once said to me, it's nice that you're there, but sometimes your responsibility is to make sure that everybody else in the room gets there. And it reminds me of the responsibility that we have to make sure that we really do listen, and that we're also conscious of the emotion that might be in the conversation, that we listen first to understand and then second to respond. And when you really think about that, most of us are very, I guess, used to or conditioned to listening to be able to respond rather than necessarily hearing. Now, I know for many of you, the idea of triage and being able to get that diagnostic and be able to evaluate the situation means you're probably a better listener than most, but it's important that we honor this in terms of the ask of others, and that we support them to practice that same principle as well. Okay, we're on the home stretch. Number 8. This is a particular point I ram home, particularly for in our education sector, where we work with tertiary institutions, particularly where there's PhDs or lecturers. The idea that being right excuses bad manner or negative behavior. Ultimately, right is subjective, and it's great that you may feel righteous in your position, and it may be that you're genuinely right in your assertion of fact or situation, but it doesn't allow you to be able to send others into a threat response, and it certainly doesn't allow you to demonstrate bad manner or create an unsafe environment for those around you. And ultimately, it also means that your point of righteousness will not be heard, so ultimately it's not effective for you either. Remember that all interactions are the subject is not responsible, and you are. So the issue doesn't dictate how we talk. Ultimately, the choice of communication, the choice of manner, the way that you approach the interaction, the time, the place, the energy, the tone of voice, your body language, all of those are your choices. An example of that, the first 30 seconds set the scene. When I jumped on the Zoom today, obviously conscious I've been thrown into the deep end with little notice, both Chris and Amanda greeted me with welcome sort of warmth and a smile and a positive energy. And those first 30 seconds in which I felt connected and engaged and supported really made sure that I felt very psychologically safe, very connected, and that I was able to feel comfortable for the session today. It's an important reminder that those first seconds of interactions, despite how challenged we might be by urgency or situation, or even where we feel threatened by the other person, those first 30 seconds really do set the scene, and the way that you engage really will determine the outcome. Finally, we get agreement and action. I mean, we're having conversations, I guess for multiple purposes, and sometimes that's about engaging to just build relationships or networks. But ultimately, in your work, and particularly for the kind of work that you do, we really do need to get action, and we need a decision, and we need swift and decisive support in terms of getting those around us to engage in a shared understanding and a shared action. It's important that we're explicit about what that looks like and the responsibility for those around us in terms of the part that they play. Otherwise, that lack of clarity is really going to challenge us in terms of implementation and our effectiveness. Remember, we talked about, I guess, the measure of an interaction is not that we had it. The measure of an interaction is that it was heard, understood, and ultimately acted on. Now, I use this as a really critical lens or a ruler to evaluate my conversations on a day-to-day basis. And it's nice that you can tick the box and acquit against a conversation that you feel like you had to have, or that was cursory, or that you felt like you were obliged to have. But it's only when it's heard, understood, and acted on that really we can tick that box and say that was an effective interaction that served my purpose or ultimately served our mission and agenda. I've thrown in a bonus sort of 11th tip here, and I've talked about this a little through the session, but the idea that passion, hierarchy, or urgency is some sort of excuse for bad manner or unsafe behavior, it's completely, not only is it wrong from a principled approach, but it is incredibly counterproductive. If you are deeply passionate, or if urgency really is the driver and the situation demands a sense of action, or that there's a hierarchy at play between medical practitioners or line of command or commissioned and non-commissioned, whatever that is, ultimately that should not be an excuse for the fact that someone sends another into a threat response or makes you feel unsafe. And again, while I'd love that to be driven by an ethic or a decision to make sure that you're doing the right thing for the right reasons, it's incredibly counterproductive because it's robbing you because you're in a threat response, even unknowingly, and those around you are in a threat response. And that means all of their cognitive ability, all of their intellect, all of their passion, all of their skill is really challenged. And it's dulling that sense and ultimately meaning you are less effective in the task at hand. That's me. So I'll stop sharing, and I understand that we might be able to have a bit of a chance to connect through conversation and example and questions from the audience. I appreciate that was incredibly fast, so I'm sorry that that was a bit of an immense download of sort of insight and tips, but I wanted to share that as a bit of stimulus to start the conversation, and then we can spend some time bringing that to life in ways that feel relevant for you guys and the work that you're doing.
Brilliant, Brad. Thank you so much. I'm just going to let you know that we did get one question in the chat so far asking
Okay.
if you could share your presentation, if that's going to be available to share.
Of course, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
fantastic. We can send that around to everybody, and we're also recording the session. And please, everybody, either stick your hand up or put your question in the chat. But I'm going to take the privilege of being one of the facilitators, and I was really interested in your comments about how you came to the meeting today. Because different things happened, and I just want to talk through that because my question is, what is unsafe is different for different people. So whilst one person might think that what they were doing was actually creating safety, it could actually come across as being unsafe. So the example that I'd like to explore is when you said you joined Chris and me at 4:45 to do our prep and get ready, and we haven't met you before. Chris was busy being lovely and grateful and thankful and introducing and nice. And I'm busy thinking, right, I really need to let Brad know what the agenda is, what the flow goes. I wanted to get the logistics done. So what I was doing was trying to make a safe space for you so you knew what was about to happen.
Yes.
Chris was making a safe space for you by making you feel welcome and warm. Now, you might have found my approach saying, here's what's going to happen, not safe, because I went straight into logistics and not into what did you have for lunch. So I just want to talk through the challenge of people's different views of safety.
Yeah, look, it's a fascinating and a really great question because our example in terms of the way both of you presented very differently, but equally both of you presented in a way that made me feel safe. I think the lens I look at is, I guess, to assume the best in someone until you're proven otherwise. Now, I appreciate that sometimes that's a giant leap for us to make. And yes, I will say to you, Chris probably speaks my safe language slightly more than you because she was very social, very personable, very charismatic, very engaging. And I appreciate that you also had the responsibility of making sure that the session didn't blow up and that the logistics were working. And that you had no connection to me or no confidence in the fact that I might be okay with this session. All very fair and very valid. But I think the other read for me is your body language, your tone of voice, your facial expression, all presented in ways that still reassured me and provided some comfort that this is a safe space where I am respected, where I feel valued, where you will support me in the task at hand. I think it's not just our spoken word, but also going in with a sense of calm. And you'll see that also I made every effort to bring a great deal of energy, probably to a point where it might have even been slightly over engineered or exaggerated, because what I was doing was looking to set the tone of the interaction. And you'll remember one of the principles was the way that we engage determines the outcome, and the first 30 seconds is going to inform that relationship. So I was not leaving it into your hands to be able to make sure that this worked or that I felt safe. I was going in fully armed to make sure that I was engineering that outcome in a way where you were warm and engaged and connected to me. But I think your fundamental point is really important. The idea that there's people walking around that are genuinely a psychopath, or that are willfully demonstrating bad manner in the workplace, or that someone is willingly risking the safety and well-being of another person. They really are, and the research provides more than enough evidence to suggest this, they really are the outliers and the anomalies. What usually happens is we're surrounded by people who have learned behaviors, usually because they've been immersed in environments that are that characteristic of bad manner, and cultures that are characteristic of bad manner, and they're products of their environment. Not an excuse, but certainly context for us to understand. The second is they may have been, I guess, harmed by an incident or event, consciously or not. It has informed the way they engage. I think all of us have a moment in our career where we were like, that was difficult. And what you don't necessarily appreciate is it forms a trigger and a behavior. And that you will find if someone presents to you in a similar way, or there are markers that indicate that you might be going to that same place of unease or where you don't feel safe, it will trigger an emotion response. One of the things that we talk about is that emotion, the strongest emotion will always win. And even as a seasoned communicator, I mean, I do this for a living. I arbitrate and mediate and coach people. I mean, I spend my days having conversations and guiding people to have better conversations. So you think I would be incredible in every conversation I have. If you want an example of where emotion challenges even the best of us, have a conversation with my partner, and he will attest to you that I am a shocking communicator. My emotion gets the best of me. I'm quick-tempered. I retreat. I am hostile. I'm passive-aggressive. All of the things that I would speak to as bad manner. And it takes an immense amount of genuine effort on my behalf to be very conscious that I'm going into negative or challenging behaviors, and to rip myself out of it and acknowledge the emotion in me and the other person, and try and bring that relationship and that conversation back to a place of calm. So the idea that there's these people walking around that are willfully being destructive or disrespectful, I want you to sort of, I appreciate that if you're in the moment and you're a victim of those behaviors, it often feels like this person is going out of their way to do it, and that you do feel very much like you are, I guess, at their mercy. The one thing I would say to you, and I want to be perfectly clear here, I do understand the courage that's required to do this, but talking about how you talk to each other and talking about what you need feels so simple, and it feels so, I guess, insufficient to be able to say to the problems that you might be experiencing in your workplace, but it really will be the key that unlocks it. So many of us run from the conversation because we worry about it further deteriorating the relationship, or it feeling confrontational, or it escalating into a place where we just can't, get away from, or that it feels like it creates an even greater level of, challenge, or makes our safety even more exposed or more at risk. Done with the right care and concern, and when we think about the idea that we go in and plan how we're going to have that conversation, not just what we're going to talk about, the idea that we go in and plan for what happens if this person cries? What happens if this person gets angry? What happens if this person throws furniture at me? I mean, I've had people want to staple my hand to the desk. If I wasn't prepared for how to handle those conversations and how to circle back to make sure that we kept that conversation on path and only focused on the subject, I would have allowed my emotion to respond, and I would have reacted. And reaction is where we find our safety and the safety of others is at risk. So that, I guess, the long story here, we probably don't have time to, but I guess in short, I really want you to think about, how do I have a conversation that puts on the table how I'm feeling? And what you can comfortably do is talk to the impact it's having on you, rather than abrasive or aggressive statements. So if I was to say to Amanda, look, you're yelling at me, Amanda will immediately take that as a accusation. She will heighten her response. She will be sent into a threat response, and she's liable, unless she's incredibly skilled and careful, to match me with an equal level or even higher level of hostility, because she feels challenged, she feels disrespected, all emotions that are entirely fair. But if I say, sometimes when you talk to me, you raise your voice, and that makes me feel uncomfortable and really challenges me to be able to understand, feel connected to you, and ultimately share our work and deliver on the tasks that you're asking of me. As much as that's still a conversation for us to have and play out about how we reach compromise and meet each other's needs, I'm much more willing to have that conversation based on that than I am if I'm starting to just make grand accusations. I'd also suggest to you the greater level of specificity you bring to that conversation. So rather than things like, I just can't work with you, I just find you infuriating, those are immediate triggers and red flags to a conversation. If you can talk specifics like, you don't respond to emails, you raise your voice when you're stressed, you don't recognize my contribution on the team or the project, those are things that you can collectively point out, and it will allow that person to then make the decision to take that as feedback and make the decision to act on it or not. Now, again, not everybody will take to that kindly, not everybody may act. But my final statement in answer to your question, Amanda, I would say the reaction doesn't necessarily equal the response. Sometimes when we call out bad behavior or bad manner, or we say to somebody, the way that you talk to me makes me feel unsafe, we get people either explode, and that's uncommon, but it does occur. But what usually happens is nobody likes to feel called out or exposed or vulnerable. And what happens is most people will just go, well, that's not my intention. And I never thought I never thought that was the case. And you must know that that was not my intention, or no, that's just silly, and you should, be more resilient, etc., etc. There's a myriad of excuses. We've all heard them. The reality is, though, the next time they go to demonstrate bad manner to you, that conversation will smack them in the face, and it will force them to think differently about how they engage with you. Not necessarily because they're good people and they've had a radical shift and they've become much more astute and careful communicators, but because they don't want to feel vulnerable or exposed, and they don't want to risk the chance that you confront them again and you raise it again, or that this is going to be a consistent feedback loop in which you're constantly saying to them they're not meeting your expectations. And so they will sort of, I guess, manage their emotion, and they'll sort of course correct the way that they engage with you as a consequence. And you'll find that there will start to be a shift in the way that they engage in their behaviors. I know that was an incredibly long answer, but it really was a really fascinating question to think about, because you really do have the opportunity. And I appreciate that from my position. I'm, A, I'm a man. B, I'm very senior. I'm often in rooms in which I'm asked to be a point of intellect or authority. And it does give me a very heightened position and a position of ease to say, you know what, I can practice these techniques in a really safe and confident space. I do appreciate how challenging it can feel and be to bring some of these things to the table. And I have every appreciation that in positions where there's hierarchy, challenge, where there's risk and consequence, where you're worried about retaliation, etc., some of these conversations can feel like they're incredibly loaded. But the principles do apply. And even if you're only dancing into them ever so subtly, or that you feel like you have to etch into them or iterate closer to them, then it will certainly start to at least do, if nothing else, reduce the impact on you and help to keep you safe, even if that just means you're locking yourself down and trying to preserve your own and those around you in terms of safety and psychological well-being. Not everything needs to be confrontational or conflict orientated. Sometimes it's about self-protection in those moments as well.
Yeah, Brad, another Amanda, was going to ask a question, but she said your answer has helped. I wonder, Amanda, if you wanted to jump on and ask the question, just to make sure that there's not some other gold bits of magic that Brad can share.
Yes, I can't see myself in a camera, so I can't tell whether
You
can
look
see
fabulous,
me.
Amanda. We can all see you. Hit me with the question.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about how to talk with team members who've had little niggly things said to them. Sometimes people can be, especially when you're dealing with things over Teams messaging, sometimes people can come across and it's just, you know, the one little word that can be a little bit snarky, and it's not enough to kind of go, hey, that was, you know, like, come on, that was way out there. But obviously over time, you know, the attitude, so it becomes really difficult to address, you know, how do you say to this person, okay, that's poor attitude, when it's just a cumulative thing. And perhaps that approach of addressing it, you know, okay, so sometimes when you respond to me, it feels like you're criticizing my performance.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I love your language.
Yeah.
I think, I love your language there. A couple of things that would be sort of signposts for me. One, it's common that people are unintentional and completely unaware that sometimes their manner or their style can be particularly offensive or confronting. And, you know, first of all, going in with a sense of compassion that says, look, I'm sure this isn't your intention, but I wanted to talk to you about impact. So you can own your experience. So you can comfortably sit and talk to, I feel threatened, I feel unsafe, I feel uncomfortable. That's not accusatory, but also you have every right to assert your feelings and the impacts of someone else's behavior. And I want you to each feel very comfortable to own that moment and say, it's not about your intention. And I'm sure it's not one that's malicious or, you know, deliberately disruptive, but I'm sharing with you that it is negatively impacting me. And I'm asking that we reach a compromise and approach it differently. Going in with the idea that both of you have a give and take, it's not just a one-sided conversation in which you ask of somebody else everything and give nothing. There's a lot of, I guess, psychology to it that says, if you start a conversation about what you're asking of others, that you all equally give something in return, and that there needs to feel like there's a moment of parity. So if you're saying, you know, I prefer phone calls rather than emails, or I need you to be less, you know, intense on the email, whatever that might be, to say, look, equally, I want to talk to you. And rather than make an assertion of a commitment that maybe you won't honor or that's not important to them, you can have an open-ended question that says, you know, is there anything that you prefer in terms of how we interact with each other that I can look to honor in the interactions that we have on a day-to-day basis? My final point to you is, if you go in, I guess, with an energy of saying, look, you know, as much as I love the idea of the feedback sandwich and that you start with something positive and then you feel something in the middle of, you know, the reality is it's so overt and sometimes so cliche. But I do think going in and saying, I'm worried that, you know, for example, you're an amazing professional, or I know how passionate you are about our work, or I know how challenging your circumstance and your role is. That's why I thought it was really important that I share with you what's happening with me. So you're going in not necessarily because you're bringing a problem. You're going in with sort of the lens of care that says, I owe it to our relationship, or I owe it to our work or the work that we do to have this conversation with you. And you'll be surprised. It's incredibly disarming for you to start the conversation with that angle, because it instantly, if you say, for example, I want to give you some feedback, you're going to get an immediate sort of, If you say, look, there's a conversation I've been meaning to have with you that I think is really important, and it's because I care for you and the work that you do, that I think it's important that we have it.
Yeah, I think that's really great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,
Great question.
Yeah, that is a really powerful tool. I'm just thinking about how I would react if somebody had said that to me, and I think I would be listening hard. Chris, have you got any questions that you wanted to raise or comments?
Oh, too many for the time available, Amanda. Because as we were joking before we came online, it turns out Brad and I both work for QPOL and in the Commissioner's office, which was an interesting place to work. But one incident that's really come to mind, because we focus very much on the workplace, but I've been also thinking about the clients. And I recall way back when dinosaurs ruled the world and I was a police cadet, I was tangled up with the 74 Brisbane flood. And this poor lady, we'd secured her physical safety. We'd rescued her from her flooding house. But obviously we hadn't paid enough attention to her psychological safety.
Mm.
And she came to the police station where I was on the counter, and I directed her to the evacuation centre and even found a nice SES friend to accompany her. And it was fascinating, even in my simplistic way as a 17-year-old that didn't understand any of this. I realised that this poor woman had been dragged out of her home in the most horrendous circumstances. Her home was lost, apparently, and yet, even in that moment of what for many people would have been terrifying, she was calm, but she appreciated the fact that I found her someone to support her through the journey to the evacuation centre. And when I saw her the following night, she said, "Oh, thank you so much. That made a real difference." She was a tiny little thing. He could have picked it up and carried her. But just these simple things are often an inject of psychological safety when you don't even understand what they mean to the people. And
Correct.
I mean, as a clueless 17-year-old, I wouldn't have understood that. I've now got a double major in psychology and many years in this space. So now I reflect back and realise you weren't really quite so stupid. You actually did something to support that woman's psychological safety. So sometimes you can innocently be helpful. So don't be
Correct.
too hard on yourself. You may be doing the right things, even if you don't always have the labels for them.
Correct. And I think that illustrates two very quick points, and I'm conscious there's another question. But one, I guess, for me, it's about the small calibrations that are available to each of us in terms of the way that we interact and engage with others, and how grand that impact may be on the other people in terms of their psychological safety and well-being. And I guess the other point for me is that you can appreciate the challenge and the situation, and you can understand why it's distressing and why it might create a sense of anxiety and distrust and distress. But that was a perfect example of where, in supporting that person and bringing care and concern to her and the rest of the community, you weren't going to allow her to bring yourself or those around you into an unsafe position, because you were moderating her behavior and her interactions by demonstrating and modeling what you're asking of her through the interactions that you had. And there's real power in that as well. People will model behavior in terms of what they see around them and often follow that as an exemplar. So that's great. Thank you. Sorry, there's another question. I'm conscious of time. Let's see how many of them I can smash and
Brad.
answer.
Yeah, we've got Laura with her hand up, so we'll jump there, and we have a couple of questions in the chat too.
Go for it.
Thank you. My question is slightly different, so I wondered if you wanted to go to the questions in the chat first.
Okay. Look, there's some really specific questions from Julianne, who says, what to do when addressing an issue with somebody, e.g. eye rolling, opens an emotional and accusatory can of worms from the person who did the eye rolling. And also Megan's asked, is saying, I'm sorry, I think I misunderstood you, I didn't make the rules clear, I think I hurt you, a good move? So can you address those two?
Yeah, look, things like eye rolling and sort of subtlety, it can be challenging. And you're right. I mean, it ultimately can start a conversation that maybe you feel slightly unprepared for, or where it's quite emotion rich, because someone feels like it's an attack. I think if you say to them something like, look, Sarah, sometimes when we chat, I'm sure, and there's a line here and it will feel very manipulative, but trust me, there's a moment of integrity guiding this. I say to someone, I'm sure this isn't your intention, but this is how it's coming across. So it's very much clearly asserting that this isn't something they're consciously or willfully doing, but I am sharing with you the impact. And you can say something like, that really does challenge me or those around us in terms of maintaining connection with you and continuing the conversation. And things like, I really value working with you, so I wanted to give you that feedback. And it's obviously up to you how you take that. But just to let you know. Now, the reality is, yes, it may very well get that person to become heightened. And they may come back with you in terms of an emotion-rich reaction. But I think in those moments, you could say something like, I really did bring this to you from a moment, from a point of compassion. By sharing with you what it is, it gives you the opportunity to obviously respond or not. I'm comfortable to continue to have this conversation with you, but why don't I leave you with it? You can process it, circle back to me if you want to continue the conversation. I think if you feel like it's escalating, look for an opportunity, in a really crass way to pull from the conversation. And don't feed into what will be the emotional sort of escalation. So you can say things like, I'm sorry if you took that, in a negative way. It was not my intention. I brought this to you because I really do care about you, and I want to make sure that you have an amazing influence and interaction and relationships across the team. And if it was me, I would want to know. And so I extended you that courtesy. Again, you can own those statements, and it affords you an opportunity to sit very comfortably in that. The other thing I would say in terms of, what was the second part of that question? Sorry.
Second question was around, is saying, I'm sorry, I think I misunderstood, or I think I hurt you. If it was you, excuse me.
Yes. I think you can always have moments of clarity and say, look, I just want to circle back and make sure that we're clear and on the same page. Or, yes, I understand you and I accept that point. I need to ask that we move forward. Remember, you do have an opportunity to assert what you expect and what you ask in a conversation. And it doesn't matter if you're talking to someone that's more senior to you. If you can clearly and professionally articulate, okay, yes, I understand that. Yes, we can agree on that point. Or, yes, I've acknowledged that. I ask that you move forward. You need to be able to feel comfortable to pull the conversation consistently forward rather than turning in a circle. You can even say things like, look, we only have limited time. I've accepted that position, or I'm comfortable with that, where we've landed on that. We can either continue to turn in a circle, or let's see if we can get through the rest of these issues on the agenda, or the rest of the issues that we wanted to raise, because it's important that we get through as much of this as possible for both of us and the work that we do. Now, it's not accusatory, it's not aggressive, it's not necessarily confronting or abrasive, but it does very clearly signal to the other person that says, I get this, I've heard it, I'm respectfully either agreeing or disagreeing, and I'm asking that you move on. If that person continues to be insistent, then what they're doing is deliberately laboring a point or circling back because they're a communication bully. Forgive me, it's a label and probably a rash one, but you need to call that and say, I've asked that we move on from that issue, because if we continue to prosecute a decision that we've already made or an outcome that we've already achieved, it's because you're doing it to be malicious or disruptive or disrespectful. And you have every right to be able to say to them, I ask that we don't do that. I'm sitting with you with the best of intention to resolve these issues. We need to move forward. Now, I know they're loaded statements, but delivered with respect and care and mindful of your tone and your body language, they can be very powerful, disruptive, and circuit breakers to the conversation to bring us back to the place of effectiveness, and also where you can comfortably stand in your place of civility, courtesy, and respect, because you haven't allowed emotion or reaction to inform how you're responding.
Yeah, brilliant. Wow. I mean, if only we could be our best selves and manage conversations that way.
Yeah.
We have hit time. I'm going, Brad, have you got another 5 or 10 minutes if anyone wants to stay on a little bit longer? And Laura, we can come to your question. But for those who have to leave, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll send around a follow-up email, and Brad's offered to share the PowerPoint. So thanks so much, and we'll be in touch. And any questions, please feed them through to us. And we can pass them on to you, Brad, for any follow-up. But I've thoroughly enjoyed that. I have a page of questions, but I'll let those that need to go and thank on their behalf. Thank you very much. And thanks for a little bit of extra time. And I'll let Laura ask her question.
Laura, hit me with it. Thank you for being so patient.
No worries. Thank you for sticking around. So I'm in Victoria, and my organisation is in the process of trying to prepare for the kind of imminent psych health regs to be introduced. I think we're the last state to do that in Australia. We, in our organisation, we have kind of exactly the things you were talking about. Culturally entrenched behaviours, passion, hierarchy, and urgency are all used as excuses for behaving badly. Being right is used as an excuse for behaving badly. And so I was just wondering if you had, one piece of advice for an organisation starting to try to tackle this in a kind of concerted, serious way. What would that be?
Yeah, look, I mean, if I put my commercial hat on, I'd say, there's a multitude of programs that I deliver through Coach that could be really helpful. And I will say, all participants are getting access to Class Act, which a lot of the principles I've mentioned today are referenced in. So it will be interesting for you to do that for no other reason. And I'm not doing this as a sell, but it will give you much more wisdom and insight into terms of how to apply the principles that I've talked about today in real life situation. But I think for you, if you're starting your journey around psychosocial safety, you can use the code and your compliance with the code at a state level, which is really, I guess an incentive that is outside of your control, but very much something that's important to honor as your lever for consciousness raising. And I'm going to give people the benefit of the doubt here and suggest that most of your people are victims of what is, like you said, entrenched bad ways of working. And, because there's no consequence, as human beings, we won't course correct until there is. If you think about when you're driving at night on a road that's really familiar, you might hit 110 in a 100 zone because you're like, I know the car, I know the road, I know what I'm doing. Immediately, if you see a radar or there's red and blue lights in the horizon, then you be instantly drop to 90, your hand goes to 10 and 2, and you become the world's best driver. That's because there's an imminent consequence and you regulate yourself because of it. So what we want to do is, I guess you can use the code and the impending sort of responsibility to comply as the lever for increasing consciousness around how you talk to each other. And it's an incredibly simple idea that is completely low risk, and it lacks accusation. It's not suggesting that you're bleeding in the hallways of bad behavior. It says that you're starting a conversation about how we talk to each other. And the impetus of that, not just compliance with the code, is because you want to make sure that people go home feeling safe, valued, and respected. Now, you can use those pillars because it essentially covers every need for an employee: feeling safe, valued, and respected. And that it's because you want to be able to do your very best organizationally, whatever your purpose or mission is, that you prioritize your people and their safety. And it starts with a conversation about how do we talk to each other in ways that make sure that we feel safe and that we feel connected and that we're able to be most productive. And in that conversation, it starts to talk about, okay, raising an issue with a colleague and saying, this is how I feel when you talk to me about this way. Or you can start to identify bad manner or bad communication behaviors, like things like eye rolling, sarcasm, social exclusion, withholding information, things that people don't necessarily immediately see as bad manner. So for example, I represent the Bully Zero Foundation. Most people are very clear around what bullying is. They'll be like, okay, it's intimidation, it's violence, it's threatening behavior, etc. It's the schoolyard kind of experience as a definition. But bullying can also be, I'm leaving Laura out of an email about an issue that's connected to her, and I'm doing it as a serial offender and with deliberate intention to exclude her. And that's bullying. It's a different form of bullying, but it's incredibly negative in terms of the impact and the consequence it has on you. I think the one piece of advice I would say to you is you've got to start a conversation that lifts people's awareness of their responsibility to have conversations in safe ways and to stop relying on the organization being the one who provides, I guess, the way that we all keep each other safe. Yes, the organization is deeply responsible and there's 1,000 things you will do as an employer. But really, the true power and the lever that's available is in your people and the interactions they have every day on email, in person, with customers. You can't regulate, you can't be in the room, you can't mediate every one of those. You got to empower people to be much more socially aware and much more responsible in the choices that they make.
Amazing. Thank you.
Pleasure. Honestly, Laura, and I won't extend this to everybody because I don't want my email to overflow, but I will ask that Amanda share with you my details, and I'm happy to have a no expectation, no cost conversation with you, even if you just view it as guidance or counsel at a strategy level or an interaction level, and it might help you in terms of language or the initial approach you take.
Wow. Well done for putting your hand up, Laura, and getting in and getting that free offer. Thank you, Brad. Look, I'll just wrap up. I did totally forget to talk about Class Act, and that we've still got 30 people on the line, and I'll put this in the email. Could you just tell us really quickly, what is Class Act and what are we giving all of the participants?
Yeah, great. Class Act is a multimodal program. It's delivered online, and it's designed to take participants through, I guess, an immersion that does the very consciousness and capability building that I was discussing with Laura. It takes about an hour, maybe 90 minutes if you were really deep diving. It works across 8 principles. A lot of those principles are what we talked about today. And it's about a 2 to 3 minute video, and it talks about what that principle is and the power of it. And then the really important part is there is a questionnaire, really basic. There's only 2 or 3 questions attached to each principle. And it's designed to encourage self-awareness around what your communication preferences and needs are, but also what you ask of others within your team. And through Class Act, when we do it with adopting organizations, we use that survey data to inform the development of a single-page communication charter, which becomes an overt commitment to and shared language for how you talk to each other safely. For you guys, we're giving you kind of a sample access. You can go in, immerse yourself in the content, answer the questions for what it's worth so that you experience it. And then it gives you a bit of exposure and a bit of learning. Obviously, it's not organizational wide. And the real benefit happens when, you see all of your people on the same page. But it will be really helpful because it's like, I guess, me on steroids and much more paced in its delivery. It will give you a chance to deep dive into things that might have really stood out to you from today as well. And it's has Leanne, who would have presented with you, feature at the helm of a lot of those videos. So you'll get a chance to connect with her, at least through that mechanism.
Wow. Well, look, I have so much I'd love to talk to you about. So what I'm thinking is we definitely maybe we can do a double act with you and Leanne to come back and do a follow-up session. We'll make Class Act available to everybody. And maybe once people have gone through that process, it might be really interesting for them to come back and ask some follow-up questions and do something. So we did talk to Leanne about getting her back, but perhaps a double act would be awesome. We would love that.
Look, obviously, I would love to be a part of the conversation. And like I said to you, I'm deeply honored. I can put my commercial hat to the side for the moment. I really do appreciate the chance to connect with you. And if it makes a little difference in the world that you have and the conversations that you have, then that's great. That's what I do. So I'm happy to help.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks very much. And thanks, everybody. I'll stop our recording now and wish you all a good night. And Brad, if you can just stay on for a sec, because I want to say thank you again.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.